Du stehst neben mir, doch du wendest dich von mir ab. Blicke treffen sich, doch Worte werden nicht gesagt. Es ist noch nicht vorüber, so viele Worte nicht gesagt, so viel noch nicht besprochen, so viele Taten nicht getan. So viele Taten nicht getan. So viele Taten nicht getan. Du liegst da neben mir, doch du drehst dich auch nicht um. Blicke treffen sich, doch die Blicke bleiben stumm. Es ist noch nicht vorüber, so viele Worte nicht gesagt, so viel noch nicht besprochen, so viele Taten nicht getan. 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 Wenn der Sturm verhallt, doch innerlich da kocht die Wut. Alles ist ganz kalt, doch innerlich da kocht die Wut. Es ist noch nicht vorüber, so viele Worte nicht gesagt, so viel noch nicht besprochen, so viele Taten nicht getan. 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 So viele Taten nicht getan.
Hello, my friends. Operator Starsky here. It's such a pleasure to see you tonight because it was a while. I got another flu and trying to recover, but I will be fine. I will be fine because I have you, my friends. Today, 23rd of November, and on this day in Ukraine, we have a memorial day. We honor everybody who died back in 1932 and 1933 during Holodomor. And tonight we will talk a bit about this event. It won't be like a very long stream, but we will definitely talk about some, personal updates and things like that. Generally, there were not one, but three types of such events that happened in Ukraine. The last one happened in 1947, as far as I remember. But generally, this one that happened in 1932, 1933 is considered the most massive and the most destructive. Back in those days, 30s, Soviet Union was extremely underdeveloped country, and other Western countries would be developed like 50 years in advance comparing to the USSR. And USSR relied on things like exporting grain, exporting resources to other Western countries in order to receive funds to continue its industrialization. But because Soviet Union was ruled by atrocious, stupid people, they were stupid and atrocious at the same time, and because the agenda of the Communist Party back in those days was extremely violent, things didn't go well on the international scale, like internationally for the USSR. And another thing was that Ukraine, that was occupied by the Russian Bolsheviks, Ukrainians did not like to be occupied, like, of course, we never do. But back in those days, Ukrainians had plenty of uprisings against the invaders. And in 1932, invaders decided to eliminate Ukrainian villagers, mostly Ukrainian villagers, but generally like as many Ukrainian civilian people as possible, by committing Holodomor. A Holodomor is like a Holocaust, only this type of Holocaust was committed by Russians, by Russian Bolsheviks, by ethnic Russians, against ethnic Ukrainians specifically. And Holodomor means literally death by starvation. It was an artificial famine. So how exactly did it start? It started when, as a result of those multiple uprisings, and since 1930s, the beginning of 1930s, between 1930 and 1933, there were between 1,500 and 3,500 armed uprisings of Ukrainians and mainly Ukrainian villagers against the communist Russians in Ukraine. Just so you could understand, it's not like Ukrainians were willfully going to die or tolerate Russian invaders on their land. It was not the case. There were multiple uprisings almost every single day, or once in 2 days. And Russians decided to conduct so-called подразверстки, коллективизации. How to translate this? So one thing you should understand, the way Russian communists back then, and generally always, treated Ukrainians. Russians established their power over the former Russian Empire, over Ukraine, etc. And this so-called government was not based on, how to say it? It was based on classes. It was basically like class-ruled government, which was a big fake because, like, Lenin, Stalin, they were not, proletarians, nothing like that. Lenin comes from a rich family, Stalin was a terrorist, but they spoke to the workers and they considered themselves like leaders of the workers. So workers, criminals, military, they all formed this kind of violent government that was ruling Ukraine, known as the Bolshevik Party. Ukrainian teachers, Ukrainian priests, everybody who were like intelligence, professors, academics, they were all killed. The villagers, because majority of Ukrainians came from villages, they were called kulaks. It was a derogative for Ukrainian villagers, and it meant, like this cunning, rich villager. This is how Russians basically called Ukrainian villagers back then, because they considered all Ukrainian villagers being cunning, being like rich, stealing things and things like that. Stealing in terms of, if you have food, you have to share your food with the people of the Soviet Union. It's not your cow, in your yard. It's our cow. It belongs to the Communist Party. You have no right to own this cow, even if this cow, as well as everything else, belonged to you like hundreds of years. The cows, the chicken, etc. Your house that was there, built like 200 years ago, everything in it belonged to the Communist Party now. So they decided to increase the tempo of so-called Collectivization and brotherhood. What those two things mean? It basically means that you have to work more time on a daily basis and give out more of your goods that would be taken and brought to places like Kherson or Mykolaiv, to the docks, and then shipped to the west or to the Moscow. It's either or. And Ukrainian villagers that worked really, really hard without weekends their whole life, raising cattle, growing crops, they were robbed by the communists big time. And even when they tried to save some of the food by digging like pits and storing food under the ground, Russians were literally scanning through the yards in Ukrainian villagers and taking that food from the Ukrainian villagers. They gave absolutely no damn about children, about anybody else, and of course for storing your food you would get arrested. So back in August, in summer 1930, by the way, who were responsible for this Holodomor in Ukraine back in those days? Three people: Stalin, Kaganovich, and Molotov. That very Molotov, that very dude. In 1930s, because Russian communists wanted more, they always wanted to take everything, as much as possible, and either bring it to Moscow, which, by the way, wasn't really, rich back in those days, again, because the government was completely unqualified, stupid, and violent, and atrocious. There were basically a bunch of thugs that violently removed the government and invaded countries like Ukraine. They were not managers. They were literally terrorists. So in 1930s, the chief of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Kosior, said that Ukrainian villagers adopted new tactics. Ukrainian villagers refuse to harvest crops. Ukrainian villager wants to rotten the grain in order to kill the Soviet government with the starvation. But we will show you what the starvation is. Literally, they established enormous temples of collectivization. I don't know how to translate it, unfortunately. And they were literally taking everything. By 1932, it was basically when the number of victims, when the number of people who died from starvation, and back then in Ukraine there were approximately 32 million people in 1930s. So in 1932, when we started losing hundreds of thousands of people dying from hunger. They decided to even increase this tempo and restrict the dissemination of bread in Ukrainian kolkhoz, the collective farming organizations and things like that. Here, for example, you can see Russian communists coming and taking that as Baryshivka in Ukraine. They were coming and taking grain, they were coming and taking food. And here, for example, same picture in Kharkiv, they were literally taking everything from Ukrainian villagers who were extremely, extremely dissatisfied with Russian atrociousness. Extremely. We never wanted them here in Ukraine. We would never tolerate them. And this kind of government, it was violent and atrocious. And it was Russian, which is basically the same. 7th of August 1932, the Bolshevik Party proclaimed that the goods, the property of the collective farming organizations must be protected. And what they adopted was, if they would ever find somebody having grain, having food, if they come to a yard and see that villagers have like bread on their table, they would be shot. But of course, it was not the case because there was no bread at all. If they saw a person walking somewhere around the grain field, which were all protected by armed people who would not let Ukrainians gather or whatever, collect grain or anything, except for bringing it to Moscow or to export it. If they found a person and search person and find grain in his or her pocket, no matter if it was like five grains, this person would be shot. And basically, with this law, they would restrict Ukrainians from having food in general. Everybody could be blamed, could be accused of violating the law because they were having food. And people were shot massively. And besides all this, people started dying. 31st of August 1932 in Luhansk, the Communist Party adopted another rule that you cannot consume bread in the public dining facilities, in the public canteens. And Ukrainians that were literally growing bread for whole the world, for the West, because West was importing grain as well from the Soviet Union, for the Soviet Union itself, for like Russia, for places like Kazakhstan, etc. Ukrainians that were growing the grain, they were simultaneously dying from starvation because all that was taken from them and they were not allowed to have it. As a result, between the numbers are extremely hard to understand for several reasons. It's because all the information about the Holodomor back in those days, all the information that Russians have, it is classified in the archives of KGB. They will not give you anything. What we know comes only from the archives of KGB that were declassified in Ukraine, for example, in the Security Service of Ukraine, based on the former KGB. And we know all the details about those atrocities from the sources that were found in Ukraine. But generally, it's really hard to understand the full scale of losses, of casualties that Ukraine faced because of this genocide. And according to different estimations, it is between 3 and 10 million people. Generally, it is considered that the number, approximately 7 million people who died due to Holodomor, is more or less trustworthy, but this number also doesn't include people who died from diseases as a result of starvation, of low immunity, and things like that. And also, victims continued through time because generations of Ukrainians were not born as a result of this massacre. So it's really, really hard to understand the whole scope, the real number of victims who died and who were not born as a result of Russian atrociousness, but generally it's considered to be 7 million Ukrainians out of 32 million Ukrainians who lived back then. We estimated that if Holodomor never happened, Ukraine would currently have a population of between 60 and 90 million people. That is according to different institutions, between 60 and 90 million people. But as of beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion, there were approximately 40. So that is the scale that we can estimate. But what does the Russia do? Russia, of course, refuses to acknowledge the fact that this catastrophic genocide was committed against Ukrainians. Specifically, basically, they say that everybody in the USSR was starving back in those days. Take a look at Kuban, by the way, populated by ethnic Ukrainians, right? Take a look at Kazakhstan, but in Kazakhstan, of course, the scale was not comparable at all. And in Kuban, Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians who lived there, they were also repressed and they were also murdered by Russian Bolsheviks in impressive numbers that we cannot even understand. Russians tried to do everything they could in order to hide the real numbers. They would barely register any deaths because people were dying every single day. Back in those days, walking on the street, you could see starving people, either dying or already dead. And generally, you can Google Holodomor, like there in the description on my channel. And you can see those horrible pictures yourself. Again, it was not meant to be public. Russians did everything they could in order not to let this information go out of USSR. Of course, you could not talk openly about Holodomor. You could not talk about it on the news, nothing like that. On the radio, it was completely forbidden, and you would risk your life had you even raised this topic, even though people were literally dying on the streets. And unfortunately, there were many, many other tragedies. There were cases of cannibalism. There were multiple cases of children dying. And unfortunately, children, because they're tiny, they cannot withstand starving for such a long while, as for extended period of time, as grown-up people. And a lot of them died. And later, 1934, 1935, people kept dying because of the acquired diseases and sicknesses that were related to starvation, to low immunity, things like that. Cases of cannibalism, unfortunately, they were massive because when a person dies and you have a big family of starving people, you do anything to survive. So a lot of those would be unfortunately eaten. The stray dogs disappeared, stray cats disappeared from the streets in Ukraine. You couldn't see anything like that. So it was something horrible. And as a result, us Ukrainians, we have this funny topic on my channel. We discuss food and stuff, but generally Ukrainians have this big complex related to food, because to us it's more than just a food. It's something on a genetical level, is something precious, I would say. That's why you will never see Ukrainians throwing away bread that went spoiled or things like that. We would better, put it in the oven and make those dried breads and things like that. We have this in our genes now, and that's why Ukrainians treat food differently than anybody else. To us, this is something different. Ukrainians like to eat more than anybody else, again, because this is something different to us. I remember grandparents, some of my grandparents went through this Holodomor as well, and they were always, I would say, when there's a big pot of borscht prepared, they would tell me those stories, when their parents were cooking borscht for the whole family, and Ukrainian families were like 5-10 kids, back in those days. And they would put this big pot of borscht on the table. The kids will just run there with their spoons and eat as much as they could, because they went through this. They knew what starvation was, because of the Russian terrorists back in those days. Russians will not acknowledge Holodomor, even though numerous countries of the world already recognized Holodomor as an act of genocide of Ukrainians. And Russians, of course, will never recognize it. And by the way, when we talk about, for example, representatives of Russian so-called opposition, people who don't want to pay Ukraine reparations, even though they say that they're against Putin, etc., but generally all opposition, so-called oppositionist Russian politicians taking refuge outside Russia, they don't support the idea of paying Ukraine reparation for this invasion that they have right now. And generally, they will never recognize Holodomor as well, because they don't want to be responsible for that. That's another reason why Russian opposition is a joke. That's why, Ukrainians have this very special feeling towards food. On my channel, we always discuss this stuff. We talk about it, in a relaxed, joking way. But I realized that even in my case, I think it's still the result of the genocide that happened back in those days. A lot of villagers, by the way, wanted to quit the collective farms, collective farming organizations, kolkhoz, because when the Russians started the collectivization in Ukraine, and the demands were enormous, like this farm should deliver like 1 million pounds of bread, and we don't care. Then the villagers would start quitting those collective farms massively because of that. And because of that, Russians in Ukraine implemented internal passports. So villagers could not have a passport and, for example, move to a different city. And as far as I remember, this law was cancelled in 70s or 80s in Ukraine. When I was born around that time, this law was only cancelled. So villagers could finally acquire a passport and become somebody, go to a city, for example, and live in a city. That's how crazy it was. So Russians also try to justify it in different ways. They say that people were starving in Kazakhstan. That's why Ukraine had to be deprived of its grain and food, and everything was like disseminated around, other nations, Soviet nations, so-called. Also, Soviet Union had to fight for its existence. That's why we had to export, and everybody felt bad because it was this long and hard way to world domination and supremacy. But at the same time, export of grain wasn't really decisive back in those days. It was not the biggest source of income in the Soviet Union, but it was done in Ukraine. It was committed in Ukraine, the collectivization, specifically in order to eliminate Ukrainian villagers, eliminate Ukrainian people, basically. Because Ukrainian people were known for their feeling of justice. We would never tolerate injustice. That's why Russian communists hated us so much, and that is the reason why Russians generally hate us today. Because Ukrainians will never tolerate injustice, and we will never tolerate being invaded. Russians also created this myth about brotherly nations and things like that, literally because they wanted our bread and our resources. Back in those days, they attacked us not because we had lithium and gas in Donbass. It wasn't discovered back in those days, but they invaded us because we had coal and we had iron and grain and food. Brotherly nations, it's so stupid. If we are brothers, then why do we care about having a good life, about having food on a table, about having farms, about having fields full of crops, about not invading other people? And at the same time, Russians don't care about it at all. They don't do they have bread because they take this bread from others. They invade other people. What makes us brotherly, guys? Some historical roots that date back thousands of years. To me, Germans or British or French are as brotherly as probably more brotherly than Russians. We are brothers because we're Slavic. What the fuck is that? Are we brothers with with African people because we have brown eyes? Or are we brothers with European people because we have this color of skin? This is stupid. Being brothers, considering yourself being brothers with somebody just because you have same color or similar language or something like that, that is freaking stupid. That is not something that makes you brothers. What makes you brothers is when you understand that you need to have collective security. You need to take the best experience from other countries, from your neighboring countries or countries far away. Remember what Grandpa Savkovich said. It's through trade and respect. That is something that makes us brothers, not barbarian invaders who come to your country, kill your professors and teachers and priests, take your bread, explaining it with the idea that you are brothers for some reason. That is something absolutely ridiculous. And that is something that we should remember, whenever people have this nostalgia for the Soviet Union, for living in the great empire. We should always remind them that this empire was built on suffering, death, and genocide. This empire was built on violence and atrociousness committed by Russians. That's the fact. Back in those days, there was no war between Ukraine and communist Russia. Ukraine was occupied generally, but there was nothing like, dynamic war as we can see nowadays between Russian invaders and Ukrainian defenders. But for some reasons, nobody can explain other than genocide. For some reasons, millions of Ukrainians were dying. Millions of Belarusian people were dying. Millions of people in Russia were dying. And they were not only dying because of hunger, they were dying because they were kidnapped. They were accused of being American spies, building American biolabs. And they were either eliminated, they were shot massively, or they were brought to Siberia, to gulags, and killed there. What kind of empire is that? Guys, never ever, please, never ever compare, for example, like United States or European countries and USSR. Whenever you hear somebody saying that, like, my freedom of speech is not respected in Italy, literally, you have my approval to punch towards the sound, okay? Because as a Ukrainian, we went through this life, if we can call it life, in the Soviet Union. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't. Freedom of speech in Soviet Union and currently in Russia, that is something not comparable to what we have in the civilized world, because there is no such freedom and there was never such freedom there. So this is just a small tour back in the history. Guys, you can find a lot on this topic, like literally Google, you can see those crazy pictures, not a lot of them, unfortunately. Again, because Russia did all they could to conceal that, to pretend that it wasn't a genocide. Same thing, like Russian people in like Kazakhstan suffered and everything. Yes, they did, but the operation of Holodomor, which was proved by historical documents, from their speeches, from their reports to the Communist Party, where they called to literally take all the bread from Ukrainians to punish them for not cooperating with Soviets and things like that. That is the case. That is something that happened deliberately in Ukraine. This is something that we will remember forever. And this is something that Russians try to conceal, try to hide, and mask it, like, yeah, unfortunately people died, but it was not our fault, Russia adopted the legacy of the USSR. When the USSR collapsed, Russia adopted this legacy. They said that, yes, we are rightful descendants of the USSR. That's why they were automatically, for example, accepted to the United Nations, to the UNSC, right? But one thing they didn't adopt was responsibility for genocides like this. And it wasn't only genocide they committed back then. There was a genocide of Tatar people from Crimea, for example, when they would liberate Crimea from Nazi German troops, and they would take the Tatar population, put them on the trains and bring them to a different corner of the Soviet Union, basically deport them from Crimea. Because Russians believed back then that if you were occupied by Nazi Germans or if you were imprisoned by Nazi Germans, you were a collaborationist. A lot of Russian prisoners of war, and not only Russian, Ukrainian prisoners of war, returned after the war. They went straight to jail. They were in prison in Germany, and then they went to prison in the Soviet Union after the war finished. Why? Because they were considered traitors. And again, it's a historical fact. All the veterans that lost their limbs, for example, lost their legs or arms, they were brought to a distant island in Russia, in the north, like far in the north, to the so-called sanatorium where they would die, literally, eventually. Why did they do that? It's because after the war, early 50s, there were plenty of veterans who lost their limbs. And communists considered that seeing them on the streets is kind of demoralizing, you know? That's why they sent all of those veterans to the island. I believe it was called Valdai. And they spent the rest of their days there without any possibility to return home. Communist Russia was and still remains, because it's still ruled by the old school Russian communists and mafiosi, an extremely atrocious gangland. And they have absolutely nothing in common with the civilized world. We have absolutely nothing in common with them. And this is something you guys must always remember. The gap between us and them is so enormous that we will never become closer. Never. First of all, nothing good comes from this place on earth. And second of all the decisions they make, all their objectives are based on violence. Our objectives and our decisions are based on life. They are based on desire to have future. Their desire is to retransmit and spread violence. That's why we have advantage over them, because according to evolution, we have more chance to survive than them, literally because of atrociousness. But at the same time, we suffer more, because their life is already suffering and they don't want to change it. So this is something we should always remember. So Holodomor, dear Neuro D, means death by starvation. Holodomor, holod is hunger, starvation, and more is basically massive death. Holodomor, it's death by starvation. This is how we call the genocide that was committed by Russians, which, by the way, went unpunished until this day. Swedish Vikings came to Ukraine already during the Viking age to conduct trade with the Ukrainian people. So I consider the Ukrainian people as my brother people. Yes, my friend, that's the case. We were trading back in the times of the Kiev Rus, which name, by the way, was stolen by Russians in the 18th century. That's why they called themselves Russia. However, there was only Kiev Rus. There was no Novgorod Rus, Muscovian Rus. History doesn't know that. And Kiev back in those days was the biggest trade center 1,000 years ago. And by the way, hundreds years before Moscow emerged in the swamps. It was before the village of Kuchkovo turned into what today is known as Moscow. Everything the Russians did is still unpunished. Not everything, my friend. And I have a beautiful proof of that. So you probably remember that Russians invaded Syria. So they basically helped the terrorist regime of Bashar Assad kill its own citizens. And you all remember what Russian aviation did to Aleppo, right? You remember those horrifying, horrific pictures and videos from strikes on Aleppo, from all those people who died from Russian bombs, etc. The only country that punished Russia for that was Ukraine. Remember that. And we punished them literally physically for that, because whenever a Russian invader dies in Ukraine, he dies not only because Ukrainians defend the Ukrainian land, he dies also because Ukrainians are fighting for Syria, for free West, for all the nations that Russia occupied and repressed. Is because Ukrainians are eliminating invaders for people in Georgia, for people who live in the occupied territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, for people who were forcefully deported from there or killed there. Ukraine is the country that punishes Russia for that. Unfortunately, not directly Putin, but eventually he will be punished as well. Without war, Ukraine is geographically central and connected for trade. That's the thing. And we have river used for transportations, for transporting goods, directly to Kyiv from the Black Sea. It's a really convenient position. And generally speaking, Crimea as well. It has a perfect position for trade, for maritime trade. We had those enormous docks in Odessa, for example, the grain facilities, the sunflower oil facilities built there. And by the way, interesting thing, what we can see nowadays is that Russia basically utilizes the same terror using starvation against Ukrainians and the rest of the world. The provisional blackmail, whenever Russia strikes grain facilities in Odessa, in Kherson, that is the continuation of their terroristic agenda of killing people with starving or terrorizing the world with starvation. That is literally the same. They do what they always did. That's like their good old tradition. Who here agrees that Operator Starsky needs a cat? Nobody does. I did have one. I want to be an Operator Starsky when I grow up. Please don't, because you will barely have personal life. I still dream of being a pilot when I grow up, but there's a long way to go. Ukraine is the original homeland of Iranians and other. There is a reason they're called Indo-Europeans. It's because they came from that region of India, Iran. But generally, it's a different topic. I think next time on the next stream we can talk more about it, because I'm not sure if I talked about it. I will tell you about one project that I was involved into back in the days when I worked at the Ukrainian television, and we did this insane research on Ukrainian genetics. Where do we come from? Like, Ukrainians living in Ukraine, right? Where do they come from? What sort of DNA, what sort of genomes we have and share? And the results were insane, because according to the research, small spoiler, according to the research that was conducted in Austria, I think, Slavic nations Well, they kind of exist, but they are not one nation. And even Slavs living on the left bank of Dnipro and Slavs living on the right bank of Dnipro, they're different people. Which, by the way, debunked the Soviet myth about so-called brotherly nations, because it was ridiculous. Further back, Iranians came from the steppes as well. I gotta ask my woman. She knows better. You didn't have a cat. You had a furry psychosis. I still have furry psychosis, but I don't have a cat. Do you find that other Ukraine-centric channels are at odds or even war with each other over ratings? I've noticed that recently. Look, I believe that such things happen back in the times when I was a sergeant in my company. We always had that, even though we were like a family, and you could have fights within the single squad, within the same squad, because we are all people and we always have conflicts. It's a natural thing, guys. When people are at odds or at war, it's a natural thing for different reasons. And in most cases, again, according to my personal experience, as a former sergeant who had to solve those conflicts, it's literally because people don't really understand each other. That is the only thing. It's not because they hate each other or because they have mercantile intentions or ambitions. It's literally because they don't understand each other in most cases, 90% of cases, and everything can be solved through communication. Hello to the beautiful Minnesota. It makes us all different. Yes, Steve, that's the thing, and that is the beauty of this, because otherwise we would be like, I don't know, like ants. They look the same, they do the same stuff, and there's nothing cool about it. Ants are extremely powerful, okay? If we take an ant colony, they're extremely powerful and they're unstoppable. They can breed millions of ants and they can conquer the lands. But eventually the colony dies because they have only one queen and they have a bunch of ants that basically look the same. That's it. When the queen dies, all the other ants, they just dissolve because the queen died. Even if another queen is born in the same colony, she will most probably not get accepted because she has different smell and she controls the ants via smell. That's why we are more advanced than ants, because we are different and we can work together solving the same issue. That is the most important thing. We can utilize our differences in order to help us solve the issues, the challenges. Ants have international conflicts. Yeah, they do. Watching from Суми. Hello, доброго вечора, Суми. Сподіваюся, що у вас все нормально. Наші думки разом з вами, друзі. Again, just to remind you guys, there was this insane Russian attack on Sumy recently, just last week, I believe, which something that doesn't surprise people already on the West, in the media. They're not really interested already because, people having peaceful life, unfortunately, getting tired of Ukrainians dying in Ukraine from the Russian bombs. but I'm really happy that, at least 691 person watching this stream right now, you guys, you do care, and I appreciate it. When I think of the prairies, I think of the Ukrainian settlers that opened them up. They were as tough as nails. Oh, yeah. By the way, do you know who were called Yukis and where this name comes from? Ukrainian settlers in the United States, early 20th century, Canada. This is how Ukrainians were called, Yukis. And my good friend Bogdan plays in the band Yukis. You gotta check it out on YouTube. Have you noticed how YouTube's auto-censorship algorithm appears to be biased against those of us who are constantly critical of Russia? Not only that. Literally, it's I would say that the algorithm is more biased on Twitter, of course, because Ukrainian content is throttled big time. By the way, I registered on the Blue Sky. Thank you very much to everyone who advised me that. But on YouTube, the algorithm is crazy in general because I don't know how to fight it. When I make a video, when I publish a video, I remove the the automatic moderation in the comments completely, okay? Still doesn't work. Sometimes it would remove commentaries that are as simple as like hello, or something absolutely neutral. At the same time, yesterday I received several commentaries from people who were saying like shit, and that would remain. I have no idea how it works, my friends. Please don't blame me for removing commentaries. I don't do that. I don't even remove Russian commentaries, literally because they help the reach of this channel. So, never gonna give you up, never gonna let you. Thank you so much, my friend. I love it. Canada, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, huge Ukrainian descendants population. Yeah. Oh my God, I believe there's something like 20% Canadians, Ukrainian descendants, something like that. I think we have some of the biggest Ukrainian diasporas there. I remember 2016, we went to the Rapid Trident, the military exercise in Yavoriv, and we met Canadians. My command liked me very much because I was a private, okay? I was not even sergeant yet. I was a private, but I could speak English. That's why they would always drag me, everywhere. So I could translate. However, our battalion commander spoke perfect English. Our sergeant major did, but my company commander, for example, would drag me everywhere because I spoke English. But with Canadians, I didn't even have to speak English because they spoke Ukrainian. And they had like literally Ukrainian last names, like every second of them, which was a pleasant surprise, like interesting surprise. Blue Sky is going to bring down X. What a stupid name. I agree. So in Ukrainian language, that is H, not X. And letter H is the same letter that the word huilo starts with. And we call Putin huilo for a reason. JC, the Music Man, you are my brother because we share a lot of interests like military and music and care about others. Razom Paramožemo. Thank you so much, my friend. Yes, we are here. Like, we had this chat today with Professor Gerdes and Anna from Ukraine, and I believe that he already posted that video. You can find it on his channel. Please check it out because it was really cool. It was something extremely motivating. And Anna said that we, like us, Ukrainian and pro-Ukrainian YouTubers, To us, you are not viewers, you are friends. But to me, you are not even friends, you are more than friends, you are family. You are people that I feel related to. Recrawlers in the chat. Hello, hello, and welcome, my friends. And again, it's so cool that, we can share like different communities and same communities and different channels with rollers, with renegades, with anybody. Only a supervillain would change his company name to X. Yeah. Maybe it's because it looks like, like swastika. Maybe. I don't believe it's because it's called to honor the SpaceX. With Elon Musk, it's not the case. Do you have merchandise like t-shirts? Yes, Uncle Ken, you can check out my description. There is the link to the store. And there is a bunch of t-shirts, patches, really, really cool hat that I would really like to have to wear myself though. But it's a big, I think it's a big complex when you're wearing stuff with your name on it. That's why I'm not carrying things with like my name on it. It's, I don't love myself that much. Caitlin T, your family too. Love you, bro. Love you too. Thank you so much. I mostly support Greg Terry. His experience is beyond my understanding. He is absolutely legendary. And by the way, Greg Terry, here he is in the chat. Hello, my brother. I hope that you feel okay. And I'm really happy that you joined us. Thank you so much. Baby Starsky via the shills. Speaking of shills, my friends, I think I will be finishing the stream earlier because the shills will start. I will be just a bit late because I have to collect a bunch of my papers here. It's just a small thing I have to do. Jilka, thank you so much for reminding me of the shills. Please check their stream right now and we will see you there, okay? Don't run away. Shills are starting, I think, approximately right now. Okay, my friends, thank you so much for being with me tonight. Please leave your additional questions in the commentaries. We can always continue our conversation there in the comments, trying to answer as many as I can. Today, I tried to follow back as many people as I could on Blue Sky, and I stopped at around 700 because now there's like 2,000, so I will be adding people all night tonight. So we'll see you there, and we'll see you at the shills too. Thank you so much, guys. I love you. You are fantastic, and thank you so much for supporting Ukraine. Ukrainians will never forget that. With that, we'll see you next time, and be safe.